I never told my son about my monthly $40,000 salary. He always saw me living simply in a small apartment on the edge of town, taking the bus to run errands, clipping coupons at the grocery store with the dedication of someone for whom every penny mattered. Marcus thought I was just getting by on my pension from the school district, where I'd worked as a secretary for 30 years. He had no idea that I'd been investing carefully since I was 25, that I owned 3 apartment buildings downtown, that the pension he thought sustained me was actually income from a portfolio worth $8 million. My name is Dorothy Hamilton, and I'm 72 years old. I have silver hair that I wear in a simple bun, hands that show the wear of decades of work, and a face that maps out every struggle and triumph of my life. I raised Marcus alone after his father died in a construction accident when Marcus was only 3 years old. James, my husband, had been the love of my life. We met when I was 19, married at 21, and had Marcus a year later. When James died, crushed under a collapsed scaffolding on a job site downtown, I was left with a toddler, a mortgage, and exactly $3,847 in savings. Those early years were brutal. I worked double shifts at the school district, answering phones and filing paperwork during the day, then cleaning offices at night after Marcus was asleep and the babysitter had arrived. I saved every penny that didn't go toward rent, food, or childcare. I mended clothes instead of buying new ones. I walked to work to save bus fare, even in the winter when the snow was knee-deep. I packed lunches in brown paper bags and made dinners from whatever was on sale at the discount grocery store. But I was also reading. Every night after my cleaning shift ended at midnight, I would go to the public library and read books about investing, about real estate, about building wealth. I studied the way rich people thought about money, the way they made their dollars work for them instead of working for their dollars. I learned about compound interest, about leverage, about the power of passive income. When Marcus was 5, I bought my first property. It was a small, run-down apartment building in a neighborhood that everyone said was too dangerous, too poor, too far gone. I paid $47,000 for it, using every cent I'd saved plus a loan from a bank that charged me interest rates that would be illegal today. The building had 8 units, 6 of them occupied by tenants who were months behind on rent, 2 of them vacant and destroyed by previous occupants. I spent every weekend for a year fixing that building. I learned to patch drywall, to fix leaky faucets, to replace broken windows. Marcus would sit on the floor playing with his toys while I spackled walls and painted trim. I evicted the tenants who wouldn't pay and couldn't be reasoned with. I cleaned the vacant units until they shined. I installed new appliances I'd bought at auction for pennies on the dollar. Within 18 months, all 8 units were rented to good tenants who paid on time. The building was generating $3,200 a month in rent. After the mortgage, taxes, insurance, and maintenance, I was clearing $1,100 a month in profit. It was more than I made at my day job. I didn't change my lifestyle. I kept working at the school district. I kept taking the bus. I kept clipping coupons. But now I was saving $1,100 a month instead of $200. I was building wealth slowly but surely, one rental payment at a time. Marcus never knew. He was too young to understand what I was doing on those weekends when we went to the building, as I called it. He thought it was just another place where mommy had to work. He played in the hallways while I collected rent and fixed toilets. He did his homework in vacant apartments while I painted and cleaned. When Marcus was 10, I bought my second building. This one was larger, 12 units, in a slightly better neighborhood. I paid $180,000 for it using the equity from my first building and another bank loan. The same pattern repeated. I fixed it up. I filled it with good tenants. The cash flow increased. By the time Marcus was 15, I was making more from my rental properties than from my secretary job, but I didn't quit. I kept working at the school district because I wanted Marcus to see his mother going to work every day. I wanted him to see that you don't stop working just because you have money. I wanted him to learn that work gives you purpose, dignity, pride. I also kept living in the same small apartment we'd moved into when Marcus was a baby. It was a modest 2-bedroom unit in a plain brick building. The rent was cheap. The neighborhood was safe but not fancy. The apartment had everything we needed and nothing we didn't. Marcus had his own room. I had mine. We had a small kitchen where I cooked our meals, a living room with a couch I'd bought at a yard sale and reupholstered myself, and a bathroom with tile I'd replaced after saving up for 6 months. Marcus grew up thinking we were poor. Not desperately poor, but certainly not well off. He saw me mending his clothes when they ripped instead of buying new ones. He saw me making his Halloween costumes from sheets and cardboard instead of buying them from the store. He saw me driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic that I kept running through sheer force of will, and a good relationship with a mechanic who charged fair prices. What Marcus didn't see was the spreadsheet I kept on my computer, tracking every property, every tenant, every dollar of income and expense. He didn't see the quarterly statements from my investment accounts, where I'd been putting every spare dollar into index funds since he was born. He didn't see the emails from my property manager, the insurance agents, the contractors I hired for the bigger jobs I couldn't handle myself. I wanted it that way. I wanted Marcus to grow up humble, to understand that life wasn't about material possessions or status symbols. I wanted him to see that happiness came from hard work, from helping others, from building something meaningful with your life. I thought I was teaching him the right lessons. I thought I was raising a good man. Marcus was a bright kid. He did well in school, got good grades, played on the basketball team. He got a scholarship to the state university where he studied finance. I was so proud of him. My son, the first person in our family to go to college, studying to be a businessman. He was going to have opportunities I never had. He was going to build a life better than mine. When Marcus graduated, he got a job at a prestigious investment firm downtown. He started making good money right away, $75,000 a year. To him, it was a fortune. He moved into a nice apartment in a trendy neighborhood. He bought new clothes, expensive suits that made him look sharp and professional. He traded in his old car for a BMW. I was happy for him. I thought he'd earned it. He'd worked hard in school, graduated with honors, landed a competitive job. He deserved to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Then Marcus met Vanessa. When Marcus was 10, I bought my second building. This one was larger, 12 units, in a slightly better neighborhood. I paid $180,000 for it using the equity from my first building and another bank loan. The same pattern repeated. I fixed it up. I filled it with good tenants. The cash flow increased. By the time Marcus was 15, I was making more from my rental properties than from my secretary job. But I didn't quit. I kept working at the school district because I wanted Marcus to see his mother going to work every day. I wanted him to see that you don't stop working just because you have money. I wanted him to learn that work gives you purpose, dignity, pride. I also kept living in the same small apartment we'd moved into when Marcus was a baby. It was a modest two-bedroom unit in a plain brick building. The rent was cheap. The neighborhood was safe but not fancy. The apartment had everything we needed and nothing we didn't. Marcus had his own room. I had mine. We had a small kitchen where I cooked our meals, a living room with a couch I'd bought at a yard sale and reupholstered myself, and a bathroom with tile I'd replaced after saving up for 6 months. Marcus grew up thinking we were poor. Not desperately poor, but certainly not well off. He saw me mending his clothes when they ripped instead of buying new ones. He saw me making his Halloween costumes from sheets and cardboard instead of buying them from the store. He saw me driving a 15-year-old Honda Civic that I kept running through sheer force of will, and a good relationship with a mechanic who charged fair prices. What Marcus didn't see was the spreadsheet I kept on my computer, tracking every property, every tenant, every dollar of income and expense. He didn't see the quarterly statements from my investment accounts, where I'd been putting every spare dollar into index funds since he was born. He didn't see the emails from my property manager, the insurance agents, the contractors I hired for the bigger jobs I couldn't handle myself. I wanted it that way. I wanted Marcus to grow up humble, to understand that life wasn't about material possessions or status symbols. I wanted him to see that happiness came from hard work, from helping others, from building something meaningful with your life. I thought I was teaching him the right lessons. I thought I was raising a good man. Marcus was a bright kid. He did well in school, got good grades, played on the basketball team. He got a scholarship to the state university where he studied finance. I was so proud of him. My son, the first person in our family to go to college, studying to be a businessman. He was going to have opportunities I never had. He was going to build a life better than mine. When Marcus graduated, he got a job at a prestigious investment firm downtown. He started making good money right away, $75,000 a year. To him, it was a fortune. He moved into a nice apartment in a trendy neighborhood. He bought new clothes, expensive suits that made him look sharp and professional. He traded in his old car for a BMW. I was happy for him. I thought he'd earned it. He'd worked hard in school, graduated with honors, landed a competitive job. He deserved to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Then Marcus met Vanessa. Vanessa was beautiful. She had the kind of polished, expensive beauty that comes from good genes, expensive salons, and personal trainers. She worked in marketing for a luxury brand, and everything about her screamed sophistication and refinement. She wore designer clothes, carried designer bags, and spoke with the kind of confident authority that makes people assume you're important whether you are or not. Marcus was smitten. He brought her to meet me 6 months after they started dating. I could tell immediately that Vanessa was judging me. Her eyes swept over my small apartment, taking in the worn furniture, the old appliances, the simple decor. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile you give to someone you pity. "It's so cozy," Vanessa said, which is what people say when they mean it's small and shabby, but I'm too polite to say so. We had dinner that night, a simple meal of roast chicken and vegetables that I'd prepared. Vanessa picked at her food, commenting on how she usually avoided carbs and how she had a trainer who kept her on a strict diet. She talked about her job, about the campaigns she was working on, about the celebrities she'd met through her work. She name-dropped restaurants I'd eaten at dozens of times, designers whose clothes hung in my closet, hotels I'd stayed at on business trips. But she talked about all these things as if they were foreign concepts to me, as if I couldn't possibly understand her world of luxury and sophistication. And I realized with a sinking feeling that my son hadn't told her anything about me except that I'd raised him alone and worked as a secretary. Marcus seemed different around Vanessa. He laughed louder at her jokes. He agreed with everything she said. When she made a comment about how quaint it was that I still used a flip phone, I actually had a smartphone but kept it in my purse. Marcus laughed and said, "Yeah, Mom's pretty old school." There was something in his tone that bothered me. It wasn't affectionate. It was apologetic. He was apologizing for me. After they left that night, I sat in my small kitchen and felt a coldness settle over me. My son was ashamed of me. He'd brought this woman into my home, and instead of defending me or explaining the choices I'd made, he'd joined her in looking down on me. But I told myself I was being oversensitive. Vanessa was young and privileged. She didn't understand lives lived differently from her own. And Marcus was in love. He was trying to impress her. It would pass. Marcus and Vanessa got married 2 years later. The wedding was extravagant, held at a country club I actually owned a share of through one of my investment partnerships, though Marcus didn't know that. Vanessa's parents paid for most of it. Her father was a retired surgeon, and her mother came from old money. They were the kind of people who measured worth by bank accounts and postal codes. I wore a simple dress to the wedding, something I'd bought off the rack at a department store. I could have worn any of the designer outfits in my closet, but I didn't. I was still playing the role I'd created, the humble single mother who'd struggled to raise her son. During the reception, I was seated at a table in the back with some of Marcus's distant relatives and a few of Vanessa's coworkers who weren't important enough for better seats. I watched my son dance with his new wife, watched him laugh and celebrate with people I'd never met. I barely saw him all night. He was too busy networking, too busy playing the role of successful young businessman married into a good family. When he did come over to my table, it was brief. He kissed my cheek, thanked me for coming, and then was pulled away by Vanessa, who needed him to meet some important client of her father's. I sat there feeling like a stranger at my own son's wedding. The next few years followed a pattern. Marcus and Vanessa lived their lives in a world of luxury I could have easily afforded but chose not to display. They moved into a penthouse apartment downtown. They vacationed in Europe and Asia. They drove expensive cars and wore expensive clothes and surrounded themselves with expensive people. And they kept me at arm's length. Oh, they invited me to things. Occasional dinners, always just the three of us, never when they had friends over. Birthday celebrations, brief and awkward. Holidays, though Vanessa made it clear she preferred spending them with her own family. Every interaction followed the same script. They would pick me up in one of their cars, embarrassed when neighbors saw the luxury vehicle parked in front of my modest building. Vanessa would look at my clothes with barely concealed disdain. They would take me to a nice restaurant and then talk about their lives, their friends, their plans, barely asking about mine. I watched my son become someone I didn't recognize. The humble, hardworking boy I'd raised had become a man obsessed with status and appearances. He name dropped, he bragged. He measured everything by its price tag. And worst of all, he'd learned to look down on people who didn't live the way he did, including me. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday in November, 6 months ago. Marcus called me in the afternoon. I was at one of my properties, inspecting a unit that had just been vacated, making notes on what repairs needed to be done before I could rent it again. I was wearing jeans and an old sweater, my hair covered with a bandana, my hands dirty from checking under sinks and behind radiators. "Mom," Marcus said when I answered, his voice tense, "I need to talk to you about something." "Of course, sweetheart," I said, stepping out into the hallway where the reception was better. "What's going on?" "It's about Thanksgiving," he said. There was something in his voice I didn't like, something uncomfortable, almost guilty. "Vanessa's parents are coming to stay with us for the week. Her father retired last year and they've been traveling a lot. They want to spend the holiday with us this year." "That sounds wonderful," I said carefully. "I'm sure you'll have a lovely time." "The thing is," Marcus continued, speaking faster now, "Vanessa is planning this whole elaborate Thanksgiving dinner. She's hired a chef, she's got this whole thing planned, and her parents are bringing some of their friends from their club and—" He trailed off. I waited. "And what, Marcus?" I asked, even though I already knew what he was going to say. "And Vanessa thinks it might be better if you didn't come this year," he said in a rush. "It's not that we don't want you there, Mom. It's just that Vanessa's parents are they're very particular. They're very focused on appearances and status, and Vanessa is worried that with your lifestyle, they might make assumptions or say something that would make everyone uncomfortable." I stood in that hallway in the building I owned, surrounded by the wealth I'd built, and felt something inside me crack. "She's worried I'll embarrass you," I said flatly. "It's not like that, Mom," Marcus protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "It's just that Vanessa wants everything to be perfect, and her parents can be really judgmental, and she doesn't want there to be any awkward moments or uncomfortable questions." "Questions about what, Marcus?" I asked, my voice hard now. "Questions about your mother who raised you alone. Questions about where you came from?" "Mom, please don't make this harder than it is," Marcus said. "It's just one Thanksgiving. We can celebrate together the next day, just you and me. We can have our own dinner. I'll bring you a plate." A plate. He'd bring me a plate like I was some charity case. "I understand," I said, my voice cold and distant. "I wouldn't want to make Vanessa's perfect dinner uncomfortable with my presence." "Thanks for understanding, Mom," Marcus said, relief flooding his voice. "I knew you'd get it. You've always been so reasonable about stuff like this." Reasonable? I'd been reasonable when he forgot my birthday because he was on vacation. I'd been reasonable when he canceled our monthly dinners because something came up at work. I'd been reasonable when Vanessa made snide comments about my clothes, my apartment, my life. I'd been reasonable because I'd thought I was teaching him humility, but all I'd taught him was to be ashamed of me. "I have to go, Marcus," I said. "I'm in the middle of something." "Okay, Mom, love you," he said casually, as if he hadn't just uninvited his own mother from Thanksgiving. I hung up without saying it back. I stood in that hallway for a long time, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of my choices pressing down on me. I'd hidden my success from my son to teach him values, to keep him grounded, to make sure he understood that money wasn't what mattered. But he'd learned the opposite lesson. He'd learned that people without money were worth less, that appearances mattered more than character, that his mother wasn't good enough to sit at a table with his wife's family. I'd failed him. By hiding who I was, I'd allowed him to become someone who valued all the wrong things. That night, I went home to my small apartment. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and pulled up my financial records. I looked at the numbers, the properties, the investments, the wealth I'd built over 40 years of hard work and smart decisions. I owned 3 apartment buildings in the city worth a combined $4.2 million, all paid off. I had an investment portfolio worth $3.8 million. I had cash and other assets totaling another million. My net worth was just under $9 million, and it generated an income of roughly $480,000 a year after taxes and expenses. I was wealthy. Not just comfortable, but genuinely wealthy. I could buy Vanessa's penthouse apartment in cash and barely notice the dent in my net worth. I could afford a lifestyle far more luxurious than anything Marcus and Vanessa enjoyed. But I'd chosen to live simply because I'd believed that living simply made you a better person. I'd believed that showing my son a modest life would teach him to value things that mattered more than money. I'd been wrong. The next morning, I made a decision. If Marcus was going to judge people by their wealth and status, then I would show him exactly where I stood. But I wouldn't do it the way he expected. I wouldn't show up at his door with bank statements and property deeds. I would let him discover the truth in a way that would teach him the lesson he should have learned years ago. I called my lawyer, Robert Chen, a sharp young man who'd been managing my legal affairs for the past decade. Robert, I said when he answered, I need you to do something for me. Of course, Ms. Hamilton, he said. What do you need? I need you to find out everything about Vanessa Parker's parents, I said. Where they live, where they go, what charities they support, what clubs they belong to, everything. There was a pause. May I ask why? Because my son just uninvited me from Thanksgiving dinner to avoid embarrassing his wife in front of them, I said. And I'm going to teach him a lesson about judging people by their bank accounts. Robert was quiet for a moment, then he said, I'll have a full report to you by tomorrow morning. Thank you, Robert, I said. The report arrived as promised. Vanessa's father, Dr. Richard Parker, was a retired orthopedic surgeon who'd had a successful practice for 30 years. He and his wife Alina lived in a gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona. They belonged to an exclusive country club. They donated to several prominent charities. They traveled frequently and expensively. They were also donors to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where they contributed $50,000 a year to the cardiac care unit. I smiled when I read that, because I was on the board of directors of that hospital. I'd been on the board for 12 years, ever since I'd made a $2 million donation to build a new surgical wing. The hospital had named a conference room after me. I made a phone call to the hospital's development director, a woman named Patricia whom I'd worked with for years. Patricia, I said, I need to ask you about two of our donors, Richard and Alina Parker from Scottsdale. Oh, yes, Patricia said immediately. Lovely couple, very generous. They've been donating for about 5 years now. Why do you ask? Because they're going to be in Philadelphia for Thanksgiving, I said, and I'd like to arrange a dinner with them. A donor appreciation dinner, something intimate and special to thank them for their support. That's a wonderful idea, Patricia said. When were you thinking? Thanksgiving Day, I said. I'll host it at my home, just the Parkers, myself, and a few other board members. Very exclusive, very personal. Ms. Hamilton, that's incredibly generous, Patricia said. I'm sure they'll be thrilled. Let me reach out to them today. Thank you, Patricia, I said. And Patricia, don't mention my name when you call. Just say a major donor would like to host them. I want it to be a surprise. 2 days later, Patricia called me back. They said yes, she said, excitement in her voice. They were actually planning to spend Thanksgiving with their daughter, but when I told them about this opportunity, they said they'd love to come. They're very excited to meet our major donors. Excellent, I said. Send me their contact information. I'll handle the rest. I hung up and sat back in my chair, a plan forming in my mind. The game was set. The pieces were in motion. Now all I had to do was wait. The week before Thanksgiving, Marcus called me again. Hey, Mom, he said, and I could hear the forced casualness in his voice. So, about Thanksgiving, Vanessa's parents actually had to cancel. Some emergency came up, I guess, so it's going to be a smaller dinner after all. If you want to come, you're welcome to join us. If I wanted to come, as if he was doing me a favor. Actually, Marcus, I said sweetly, I have plans now. I'm having Thanksgiving with some friends, but thank you for the invitation. There was a surprised silence. Oh, Marcus said, okay. Well, maybe we can get together the day after? Maybe, I said noncommittally. I'll have to check my schedule. I've been quite busy lately. We hung up and I smiled. Marcus had no idea that his in-laws hadn't canceled because of an emergency. They'd canceled on him because they'd received a better offer. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and bright. I woke up early in my small apartment, but I didn't stay there. I drove across town in my old Honda Civic to the house I'd bought 3 years ago, but never told anyone about. It was a beautiful historic brownstone in the city's most prestigious neighborhood, 5 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a gourmet kitchen, and a dining room that could seat 20 people comfortably. I'd bought it as an investment initially, but I'd always thought of it as the home I'd move into someday when I was ready to stop pretending to be poor. Today felt like the right day. I spent the morning preparing. I'd hired a chef to cook the meal, but I supervised every detail. The table was set with china and crystal. The flowers were elegant but understated. The menu was exquisite: roasted heritage turkey, truffle mashed potatoes, haricots verts with almonds, butternut squash soup, cranberry compote, and 3 different pies for dessert. At 2 o'clock, my guests began to arrive. First came the other board members from the hospital, 3 couples who were all major donors and prominent citizens. We greeted each other warmly. They knew me well, knew my work, knew my contributions. At 2:30, the doorbell rang. I opened it myself. Standing on my doorstep were Richard and Alina Parker, Vanessa's parents. They were dressed elegantly, Richard in a suit and Alina in a designer dress. They looked exactly as I'd expected: wealthy, polished, and confident. "Dr. and Mrs. Parker," I said, extending my hand. "Welcome, I'm Dorothy Hamilton. I'm so pleased you could join us." "Thank you for having us," Richard said, shaking my hand. "We were very intrigued by this invitation. Patricia spoke so highly of you." "Please come in," I said, stepping aside. They walked into my home, and I watched their eyes widen as they took in the beautiful interior, the artwork on the walls, the obvious signs of wealth and taste. "What a beautiful home," Alina said. "Have you lived here long?" "I bought it a few years ago," I said. "Please, let me introduce you to the other guests." We moved into the living room where the other board members were having cocktails. I made introductions. Richard and Alina were clearly impressed, dropping into easy conversation with people who shared their social status and interests. Halfway through the cocktail hour, Alina turned to me. "I have to say, Ms. Hamilton, when Patricia told us about this dinner, we were so curious. We've been donating to the hospital for years, but we've never been invited to something quite so intimate and special." "Well, the hospital values all of its donors," I said, "but we like to give special recognition to those who have shown consistent support. Your donations to the cardiac care unit have been wonderful." "It's our pleasure," Richard said. "Helping children is something we're both passionate about." "As am I said. "That's why I funded the new surgical wing 12 years ago." There was a brief pause. Alina's eyes widened slightly. "You funded the surgical wing?" she asked. "The Hamilton wing?" "Yes," I said simply. Richard looked at me with new respect. "That was a $2 million donation," he said. "Plus you serve on the board. You must be very dedicated to the hospital's mission." "I am," I said. "I believe in giving back. I've been very fortunate in my life, and I think those of us who have resources have a responsibility to use them to help others." We were called to dinner. As we sat around the table, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about the hospital, about healthcare policy, about charitable giving. Richard and Alina fit right in, contributing to the discussion with intelligence and insight. Halfway through the meal, Alina turned to me. "Dorothy," she said, we were on a first-name basis now, "I have to ask, you mentioned you've been fortunate in your life. What field are you in? Real estate, finance?" "Both, actually," I said. "I started in real estate many years ago. I bought my first apartment building when I was in my 20s. I've built a small portfolio over the years, and I've been investing in the market since I was quite young. I've been very lucky." "Luck and skill," Richard corrected. "Real estate investing requires knowledge and courage, especially when you start with your first property. That's always the hardest step." "It was," I agreed. "I was 28, recently widowed with a young son. I took every penny I'd saved and bought a rundown building in a rough neighborhood. Everyone told me I was crazy. But I fixed it up, filled it with good tenants, and used the income to buy another building. Then another." Alina was looking at me with fascination. "You were a single mother and a real estate investor?" she asked. "That must have been incredibly difficult." "It was," I said, "but it was also incredibly rewarding. I wanted to build security for my son and myself. I wanted to make sure we'd always be okay no matter what life threw at us." "Your son must be very proud of you," Alina said. I took a sip of wine before answering. "Actually," I said carefully, "my son doesn't know about any of this." The table went quiet. Everyone was looking at me now. "He doesn't know?" Richard asked, confused. "No," I said. "When my son was growing up, I wanted him to understand the value of hard work and humility. I didn't want him to grow up entitled or spoiled. So I lived modestly. I kept working my day job as a secretary, even after my investments were generating significant income. I drove an old car, lived in a small apartment, clipped coupons at the grocery store. I wanted him to see that wealth wasn't about what you displayed, but about what you built. That's a very admirable philosophy, one of the other board members said. I thought so, I said, but I'm beginning to think I made a mistake. Because instead of learning that material things don't matter, my son learned to be ashamed of people who don't display wealth. He learned to judge people by their appearances, by their clothes, by where they live. Alina was watching me carefully now. What makes you say that? She asked. I met her eyes directly. Because 2 weeks ago, my son uninvited me from Thanksgiving dinner. He said his wife's parents were very particular, very focused on appearances and status, and she was worried that I would embarrass them. Alina's face went pale. Richard's jaw tightened. Your son's name, Alina said slowly, is Marcus? Yes, I said, and his wife is Vanessa, Alina continued. Yes, I said again. We're supposed to be at their apartment right now, Richard said, his voice hard, having Thanksgiving dinner with them. I know, I said, but when Patricia called and told you about this dinner you accepted, you chose to come here instead. Alina put down her fork, her hands were shaking. Are you telling me, she said carefully, that you arranged this dinner specifically to show us who you really are? To prove to us that you're not the poor, struggling single mother Marcus and Vanessa made you out to be? No, I said. I arranged this dinner because Richard and Alina Parker are generous donors to a hospital I care deeply about. I wanted to thank you for your contributions and get to know you better. The fact that you're also my son's in-laws is a complication. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying me. You said you live in a small apartment and drive an old car, he said. Is that true? Yes, I said. I still live in the same two-bedroom apartment I moved into when Marcus was a baby. I still drive the same Honda Civic I bought 15 years ago. Those things are true. But you also own this house, Alina said, gesturing around us. I own this house, I confirmed, and 3 apartment buildings, and a significant investment portfolio. I live simply by choice, not necessity. And Marcus doesn't know, Richard said. Marcus knows I worked as a secretary and that I live modestly, I said. He doesn't know that I was also building wealth the entire time. He doesn't know that the humble single mother he's ashamed of is actually more successful than he is. Alina closed her eyes. Oh my God, she whispered. What have we done? Alina opened her eyes and looked at me with an expression of genuine horror. Dorothy, I am so deeply sorry, she said. We had no idea, Vanessa told us. She painted a very different picture. What exactly did Vanessa tell you? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Richard cleared his throat uncomfortably. She told us that Marcus's mother had raised him alone in poverty, that you'd worked as a secretary your whole life and were now living on a small pension. She said you lived in a rough neighborhood, that you struggled to make ends meet. She made it sound like Marcus had pulled himself up by his bootstraps, that he'd escaped a difficult background to become successful. She made you sound like a Dickens novel, Alina added, her voice tight with anger. Like some noble but pitiable figure. She used words like unfortunate circumstances and limited opportunities. She said Marcus was embarrassed to have you meet us because you didn't understand the world he'd moved into. I took a slow breath, feeling the anger rise in my chest. And what did you think when she told you these things? I asked. Alina had the grace to look ashamed. We thought it was admirable, she admitted. We thought Marcus had overcome adversity. We thought it showed character that he'd risen above his circumstances. And honestly, we were a little relieved that you wouldn't be at Thanksgiving dinner, because we didn't want to deal with the awkwardness of having someone there who wouldn't fit in. The other guests at the table were silent, watching this unfold with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a car accident. But Vanessa lied, Richard said, his voice growing harder. She deliberately misrepresented you to us. She made us complicit in excluding you from a family gathering based on false pretenses. I don't think Vanessa lied deliberately, I said, though the words tasted bitter in my mouth. I think Vanessa believes what she told you. Marcus believes it too. They look at my apartment, my car, my clothes, and they see poverty. They see someone to be pitied or hidden away. They don't see the choices behind those things. They don't see the values. But why didn't you tell them? Alina asked. Why didn't you explain? Because I was still trying to teach the lesson, I said. I thought if I just kept living modestly, kept demonstrating that happiness and worth don't come from material things, eventually Marcus would understand. But he didn't. He learned the opposite lesson. He learned that appearances are everything, that people without visible wealth are worth less, that his own mother wasn't good enough to sit at a table with you. One of the other board members, a woman named Catherine who'd been listening intently, spoke up. "What are you going to do now, Dorothy?" she asked gently. I looked around the table at these successful, wealthy people who knew me for who I actually was, not who my son thought I was. "I'm going to continue with my plan," I said. "I'm going to let Marcus discover the truth, but not from me telling him, from him seeing it with his own eyes." "How?" Richard asked. I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. "Marcus works at Brightstone Investments, doesn't he?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Yes," Alina confirmed. "He's been there for about 6 years now. He's doing quite well, from what we understand." "He's doing adequately," I corrected. "I know because Brightstone Investments is one of the firms that manages part of my portfolio. I have about $800,000 invested with them. I'm not one of their largest clients, but I'm significant enough that the senior partners know who I am." Richard's eyes widened. "Does Marcus know you're a client?" "No," I said. "My account is managed under a trust name, not my personal name, the Carter Family Trust." "Marcus has no idea that the Carter Family Trust belongs to his mother." "What are you planning?" Alina asked, and I could hear both apprehension and curiosity in her voice. "I'm planning to visit the office next week," I said. "I'm planning to have a meeting with the senior partners to discuss my portfolio. I'm planning to be there when Marcus sees me, when he realizes who I am and what I represent to his firm. And then I'm going to let him make the next choice." "What choice?" Catherine asked. "The choice between continuing to be ashamed of his mother or finally seeing her for who she really is," I said. The dinner continued, but the mood had shifted. Richard and Alina were quiet, processing this information. The other guests were sympathetic, but also clearly relieved this drama wasn't happening in their own families. We finished the meal with pumpkin pie and coffee, and slowly the guests began to leave. Richard and Alina were the last to go. As they stood in my foyer putting on their coats, Alina turned to me. "Dorothy," she said, "I want you to know that we had no idea Vanessa had excluded you from Thanksgiving. If we'd known the truth, we would never have allowed it. We would have insisted you be there. Would you?" I asked. "Or would you have been uncomfortable having the poor secretary mother at the table, even if you were too polite to say so?" Alina flinched. "That's fair," she said. "I'd like to say we would have been better than that, but honestly, I don't know. We've lived in a bubble of privilege for so long, we've forgotten what it's like to look past appearances." "At least you're honest," I said. Richard extended his hand. "I hope you'll give us a chance to make this right," he said. "I'd like to talk to Marcus and Vanessa about this. I'd like them to understand what they've done." "Please don't," I said. "Not yet. Let me handle this my way. After next week, after Marcus sees the truth, then you can say whatever you want to your daughter. But right now, this is between me and my son." "All right," Richard said. "But Dorothy, for what it's worth, I think Marcus is a fool. Any man who would be ashamed of a mother like you doesn't deserve what you've built." They left, and I stood in my beautiful home, surrounded by the evidence of my success, and felt utterly alone. I'd spent 40 years building wealth, building security, building a legacy. And my son didn't even know it existed. That weekend, I prepared carefully for my visit to Brightstone Investments. I went through my closet, past the worn cardigans and simple dresses, to the section where I kept my business clothes. I selected a Armani suit in charcoal gray, tailored perfectly to my frame. I paired it with a silk blouse, pearl earrings, and Ferragamo heels. I had my hair professionally styled, subtle but elegant. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a woman of power and substance. Monday morning, I called Brightstone Investments and asked to speak to Martin Ashford, the managing partner. "Ms. Hamilton," Martin said warmly when he came on the line, "what a pleasure to hear from you. Is everything all right with your portfolio?" "Everything is fine, Martin," I said. "But I'd like to come in for a review meeting. I'm considering increasing my investment with the firm, and I'd like to discuss some options." "Of course," Martin said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. A client willing to increase their investment was always good news. "When would you like to come in? How about Thursday afternoon?" I suggested. "Say 2 o'clock. Thursday at 2 is perfect," Martin confirmed. "I'll have Robert join us as well. He's been managing your account directly." Excellent, I said. I'll see you then. I hung up and felt a grim satisfaction. Thursday at 2 o'clock. That was right in the middle of the workday when the office would be full when Marcus would be there. The next few days dragged by. I went through my normal routine, checking on my properties, meeting with my property manager, reviewing financial statements. But my mind was on Thursday. I was nervous, I realized. Not about the meeting itself, but about seeing Marcus's face when he realized the truth. Part of me wanted to back out, to just continue living my quiet life and let Marcus continue thinking whatever he wanted to think about me. It would be easier. It would avoid confrontation. But the part of me that had been uninvited from Thanksgiving, the part that had been treated like an embarrassment, the part that had watched my son become someone I didn't recognize, that part wanted him to know, needed him to know. Thursday arrived. I dressed carefully in my Armani suit, my good jewelry. I drove my old Honda Civic to the Brightstone building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the financial district. I parked in the underground garage and took the elevator to the 23rd floor. The reception area of Brightstone Investments was all polished marble and modern art. A young woman sat at the reception desk, impeccably dressed and perfectly polished. "Good afternoon," I said. "Dorothy Hamilton to see Martin Ashford." The receptionist checked her computer and smiled. "Of course, Ms. Hamilton, Mr. Ashford is expecting you. Please have a seat and someone will be with you shortly." I sat in one of the sleek leather chairs and waited. I could see into the main office area through glass walls. I could see young men and women in expensive suits moving between cubicles and offices, talking on phones, staring at computer screens. And then I saw him. Marcus was walking down the hallway with a stack of files, talking to another young man. He was wearing a navy suit that I knew cost at least $2,000. His hair was styled, his shoes polished. He looked successful, confident, like he belonged in this world of money and power. He looked right past me. He glanced at the reception area, saw a well-dressed older woman waiting, and didn't give me a second look. He didn't recognize his own mother. "Ms. Hamilton?" A voice interrupted my thoughts. A young man in his 30s stood before me, extending his hand. "I'm Robert Greene. I manage your account. Martin is ready for us now." I shook his hand and followed him through the glass doors into the office proper. We walked down a corridor lined with conference rooms and private offices. I could feel people glancing at me, the way junior staff always look at clients, trying to assess their importance. We reached a corner office with Martin Ashford's name on the door. Robert knocked and opened it. Martin Ashford was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished. He stood when I entered, coming around his desk to shake my hand warmly. "Dorothy," he said, "it's wonderful to see you. Please sit down. Can we get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you," I said, settling into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Robert sat beside me, pulling out a tablet and calling up my account information. Martin sat back down behind his desk, his fingers steepled, giving me his full attention. "So," Martin said, "you mentioned you're considering increasing your investment with us. We're delighted to hear that. You've been a valued client for many years." "I have," I agreed, "and I've been very pleased with the returns, but I'm at a point where I'm thinking about consolidating some of my investments. I have accounts with several firms, and I'm considering moving more of my portfolio under one management to simplify things." Martin leaned forward, interested. "How much are we talking about?" "I'm thinking of moving approximately $2 million from other accounts into Brightstone," I said. The room got very quiet. Robert's eyes widened. Martin's professional composure cracked slightly, showing genuine surprise and pleasure. That's a significant increase," Martin said carefully. "We'd be honored to manage those assets for you, Dorothy. May I ask what's prompting this decision?" "Several things," I said. "I'm getting older, I want to simplify my affairs, and I've been impressed with how you've managed the Carter Family Trust. I think it's time to consolidate and plan for the future." "Well, we appreciate your confidence in us," Martin said. "Robert, why don't you walk Ms. Hamilton through some portfolio options for how we might invest these additional funds?" For the next 20 minutes, Robert presented various investment strategies, showing me charts and projections on his tablet. I asked intelligent questions, challenged some assumptions, and made it clear I wasn't a passive investor who simply handed over money and hoped for the best. Martin watched this exchange with growing respect. "You clearly have a sophisticated understanding of the markets," he said. "I've been investing for over 40 years," I said. I've learned a few things. May I ask, Martin said carefully, what you did professionally before you retired? I was a secretary at the Riverside School District, I said. I answered phones and filed paperwork for 30 years. The silence that followed was profound. Martin and Robert exchanged glances, clearly trying to reconcile the image of a school secretary with the wealthy, sophisticated investor sitting before them. That's impressive, Martin finally said. To build this kind of wealth on a secretary's salary requires extraordinary discipline and financial acumen. And good timing, I added. I bought my first property at the right time in the right neighborhood, and I was lucky in my investments. But yes, it took discipline. It took living below my means for decades. It took making choices that other people didn't understand. Well, those choices certainly paid off, Robert said. There was a knock at the door. Martin's secretary poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but Marcus is here. He says he needs to speak with you about the Caldwell account. He says it's urgent. My heart started beating faster. This was it. Tell him to wait just a moment, Martin said. We're nearly finished here. Actually, I said, standing, I should go. We've covered everything we needed to discuss. Why don't you have your assistant draw up the paperwork for the account transfer, and I'll review it next week? Perfect, Martin said, standing as well. Let me walk you out. We exited the office, Martin on one side of me and Robert on the other. As we stepped into the corridor, I saw Marcus standing by Martin's secretary's desk, a file folder in his hand. He looked up as we approached. His eyes swept over us dismissively at first, the way employees look at clients they don't know. Then his gaze landed on me. I watched his face go through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and then complete disbelief. Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stopped walking. Martin and Robert stopped as well, looking between Marcus and me with confusion. Hello, Marcus, I said calmly. What are you doing here? Marcus stammered. He looked at my suit, my styled hair, my expensive accessories. Why are you dressed like that? I'm here for a business meeting, I said. Mr. Ashford and Mr. Green have been managing my investment portfolio. Marcus looked at Martin, then at Robert, then back at me. Your investment portfolio? He repeated, as if I'd just spoken in a foreign language. Martin, ever the professional, had put the pieces together quickly. Marcus, he said carefully, do you know Miss Hamilton? She's my mother, Marcus said, still staring at me like I was a ghost. Your mother, Martin repeated. He looked at me with new understanding. I didn't realize you had a son working here, Dorothy. Excellent, I said. I'll see you then. I hung up and felt a grim satisfaction. Thursday at 2 o'clock. That was right in the middle of the workday, when the office would be full, when Marcus would be there. The next few days dragged by. I went through my normal routine, checking on my properties, meeting with my property manager, reviewing financial statements, but my mind was on Thursday. I was nervous, I realized. Not about the meeting itself, but about seeing Marcus's face when he realized the truth. Part of me wanted to back out, to just continue living my quiet life and let Marcus continue thinking whatever he wanted to think about me. It would be easier. It would avoid confrontation. But the part of me that had been uninvited from Thanksgiving, the part that had been treated like an embarrassment, the part that had watched my son become someone I didn't recognize, that part wanted him to know, needed him to know. Thursday arrived. I dressed carefully in my Armani suit, my good jewelry. I drove my old Honda Civic to the Brightstone building, a gleaming tower of glass and steel in the financial district. I parked in the underground garage and took the elevator to the 23rd floor. The reception area of Brightstone Investments was all polished marble and modern art. A young woman sat at the reception desk, impeccably dressed and perfectly polished. Good afternoon, I said. Dorothy Hamilton to see Martin Ashford. The receptionist checked her computer and smiled. Of course, Ms. Hamilton, Mr. Ashford is expecting you. Please have a seat and someone will be with you shortly. I sat in one of the sleek leather chairs and waited. I could see into the main office area through glass walls. I could see young men and women in expensive suits moving between cubicles and offices, talking on phones, staring at computer screens. And then I saw him. Marcus was walking down the hallway with a stack of files, talking to another young man. He was wearing a navy suit that I knew cost at least $2,000. His hair was styled, his shoes polished. He looked successful, confident, like he belonged in this world of money and power. He looked right past me. He glanced at the reception area, saw a well-dressed older woman waiting, and didn't give me a second look. He didn't recognize his own mother. Ms. Hamilton? A voice interrupted my thoughts. A young man in his 30s stood before me, extending his hand. I'm Robert Greene. I manage your account. Martin is ready for us now. I shook his hand and followed him through the glass doors into the office proper. We walked down a corridor lined with conference rooms and private offices. I could feel people glancing at me, the way junior staff always look at clients, trying to assess their importance. We reached a corner office with Martin Ashford's name on the door. Robert knocked and opened it. Martin Ashford was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished. He stood when I entered, coming around his desk to shake my hand warmly. Dorothy, he said, it's wonderful to see you. Please sit down. Can we get you anything? Coffee? Water? I'm fine, thank you, I said, settling into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. Robert sat beside me, pulling out a tablet and calling up my account information. Martin sat back down behind his desk, his fingers steepled, giving me his full attention. So, Martin said, you mentioned you're considering increasing your investment with us. We're delighted to hear that. You've been a valued client for many years. I have, I agreed, and I've been very pleased with the returns, but I'm at a point where I'm thinking about consolidating some of my investments. I have accounts with several firms, and I'm considering moving more of my portfolio under one management to simplify things. Martin leaned forward, interested. How much are we talking about? I'm thinking of moving approximately $2 million from other accounts into Brightstone, I said. The room got very quiet. Robert's eyes widened. Martin's professional composure cracked slightly, showing genuine surprise and pleasure. That's a significant increase, Martin said carefully. We'd be honored to manage those assets for you, Dorothy. May I ask what's prompting this decision? Several things, I said. I'm getting older. I want to simplify my affairs, and I've been impressed with how you've managed the Carter Family Trust. I think it's time to consolidate and plan for the future. Well, we appreciate your confidence in us, Martin said. Robert, why don't you walk Ms. Hamilton through some portfolio options for how we might invest these additional funds? For the next 20 minutes, Robert presented various investment strategies, showing me charts and projections on his tablet. I asked intelligent questions, challenged some assumptions, and made it clear I wasn't a passive investor who simply handed over money and hoped for the best. Martin watched this exchange with growing respect. You clearly have a sophisticated understanding of the markets, he said. I've been investing for over 40 years, I said. I've learned a few things. May I ask, Martin said carefully, what you did professionally before you retired? I was a secretary at the Riverside School District, I said. I answered phones and filed paperwork for 30 years. The silence that followed was profound. Martin and Robert exchanged glances, clearly trying to reconcile the image of a school secretary with the wealthy, sophisticated investor sitting before them. That's impressive, Martin finally said. To build this kind of wealth on a secretary's salary requires extraordinary discipline and financial acumen. And good timing, I added. I bought my first property at the right time in the right neighborhood, and I was lucky in my investments. But yes, it took discipline. It took living below my means for decades. It took making choices that other people didn't understand. Well, those choices certainly paid off, Robert said. There was a knock at the door. Martin's secretary poked her head in. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but Marcus is here. He says he needs to speak with you about the Caldwell account. He says it's urgent. My heart started beating faster. This was it. Tell him to wait just a moment, Martin said. We're nearly finished here. Actually, I said, standing, I should go. We've covered everything we needed to discuss. Why don't you have your assistant draw up the paperwork for the account transfer, and I'll review it next week? Perfect, Martin said, standing as well. Let me walk you out. We exited the office, Martin on one side of me and Robert on the other. As we stepped into the corridor, I saw Marcus standing by Martin's secretary's desk, a file folder in his hand. He looked up as we approached. His eyes swept over us dismissively at first, the way employees look at clients they don't know. Then his gaze landed on me. I watched his face go through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, shock, and then complete disbelief. Mom, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I stopped walking. Martin and Robert stopped as well, looking between Marcus and me with confusion. Hello, Marcus, I said calmly. What are you doing here? Marcus stammered. He looked at my suit, my styled hair, my expensive accessories. Why are you dressed like that? I'm here for a business meeting, I said. Mr. Ashford and Mr. Green have been managing my investment portfolio. Marcus looked at Martin, then at Robert, then back at me. Your investment portfolio? He repeated, as if I'd just spoken in a foreign language. Martin, ever the professional, had put the pieces together quickly. Marcus, he said carefully, do you know Miss Hamilton? She's my mother, Marcus said, still staring at me like I was a ghost. Your mother, Martin repeated. He looked at me with new understanding. I didn't realize you had a son working here, Dorothy. It never came up, I said simply. Robert was looking at Marcus with a new expression. Hamilton, he said slowly. The Carter Family Trust. Carter was your mother's married name? Yes, I said. I set up the trust after my husband died. I used his name to keep things separate from my personal accounts. Marcus's face had gone pale. The Carter Family Trust, he repeated. How much? How much do you have invested with this firm? Currently about $800,000, I said. Though I'm planning to increase that to approximately $3 million. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward. 3 million, he whispered. Yes, I said. I'm consolidating some of my other investments, simplifying things. Other investments, Marcus said. His voice sounded hollow, automated. You have other investments. Of course, I said. I have accounts with several firms, plus my real estate holdings and other assets I like to diversify. Martin was watching this exchange with fascination. Marcus, he said, perhaps you should sit down. You look pale. I'm fine, Marcus said, though he clearly wasn't. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Mom, I don't understand. You live in that tiny apartment. You drive that old car. You clip coupons. How do you have millions of dollars? I've always had it, I said quietly. I built it over the years, starting when you were a baby. Every penny I saved, I invested. Every investment I made carefully and strategically. The apartment is small because I don't need a big space. The car is old because it runs fine. And I clip coupons because wasting money offends me, no matter how much money I have. But you never told me, Marcus said, and now I could hear anger creeping into his voice. You let me think you were struggling. You let me worry about you. Did you worry about me, Marcus? I asked. Or were you embarrassed by me? He flinched. Because 2 weeks ago, I continued, my voice steady and cold, you uninvited me from Thanksgiving dinner because you were afraid I would embarrass you in front of Vanessa's parents. You told me they were particular about appearances and status. You said Vanessa was worried I wouldn't fit in. Martin and Robert had gone very still, clearly uncomfortable but unable to look away. You judged me by my apartment and my car, I said. You assumed that because I lived simply, I was poor. You assumed that because I didn't display wealth, I didn't have it. You made the same mistake everyone makes, confusing net worth with lifestyle. Mom, Marcus started. Do you know where I was on Thanksgiving? I interrupted. I was having dinner with Richard and Alina Parker, your in-laws. They were my guests at my home. We had a lovely meal and a fascinating conversation about charitable giving and the responsibility that comes with wealth. Marcus's face went from pale to gray. You had Thanksgiving with Vanessa's parents? Yes, I said. They're donors to the Children's Hospital where I serve on the board of directors. I invited them to a donor appreciation dinner. They had a choice: Thanksgiving with their daughter and son-in-law, or Thanksgiving with a major hospital donor. They chose me. They didn't even know I was your mother until halfway through dinner. Oh my God, Marcus whispered. They were quite surprised, I continued, when I told them that my son had uninvited me from dinner because his wife was ashamed of me. They were horrified, actually. Your mother-in-law apologized profusely for being complicit in excluding me based on false assumptions. The corridor had gone completely silent. I could see other employees pretending to work while clearly listening to every word. Here's what's going to happen now, Marcus, I said, my voice businesslike. You're going to go home tonight and have a conversation with your wife. You're going to tell her the truth about who your mother is and what she's built. You're going to explain to her that the poor, struggling secretary she pitied is actually wealthier than her family. And then you're both going to decide what kind of people you want to be. Mom, please, Marcus said, and now there were tears in his eyes. I didn't know. If you'd known I had money, you wouldn't have been ashamed of me. I finished. That's exactly the problem, Marcus. Your respect for me should never have been based on my bank account. You should have respected me because I'm your mother, because I raised you alone, because I worked hard and sacrificed for you. But instead, you learned to measure people by their net worth, and when you measured me that way, you found me lacking. I turned to Martin and Robert. Gentlemen, thank you for your time today. I'll expect those papers next week. Of course, Miss Hamilton, Martin said quietly. I walked past Marcus without looking at him. I walked through the glass doors, past the receptionist to the elevator. I pressed the button and waited. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Marcus had followed me. Mom, wait, he said. Please, we need to talk about this. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside and turned to face him. You're right, we do need to talk, I said. But not here, not now. You need to go home and think about the choices you've made. You need to look at yourself honestly and decide if this is the man you want to be. And then, when you're ready to have a real conversation, not as my son trying to justify himself, but as a man trying to understand where he went wrong, you can call me. When? Marcus asked desperately. When can I call you? When you're ready to apologize for the right reasons, I said. Not because you're embarrassed that your colleagues heard what happened, not because you're afraid I'll cut you out of my will, but because you genuinely understand what you did wrong and why it hurt me. The elevator doors started to close. Marcus reached out as if to stop them, but then pulled his hand back. The last thing I saw before the doors closed completely was my son's face, tears streaming down his cheeks, finally understanding what he'd lost. I rode down to the parking garage in silence. I got into my old Honda Civic and sat there for a long time, my hands on the steering wheel, my own tears falling freely now. I had exposed the truth. I had shown Marcus who I really was. But instead of feeling triumphant, I felt empty. Because the look on his face hadn't been shame at misjudging me, it had been shock at discovering my wealth. Even now, even after everything, he was still measuring me by my money. I started the car and drove back to my small apartment. When I got inside, I didn't go to my beautiful brownstone. I came here, to this modest two-bedroom with its worn furniture and old appliances, because this was my real home. This was where I'd raised my son. This was where I'd chosen to stay even after I could afford to leave. I sat in my kitchen and waited for the phone to ring. I didn't know if Marcus would call tonight, tomorrow, or ever, but I knew that the next move was his. I'd done what I needed to do, I'd shown him the truth. Now he had to decide what to do with it. Hours passed. The afternoon faded into evening. My phone sat on the table, silent. Finally, at 8 o'clock, it rang. I looked at the caller ID. It was Marcus. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. Hello, Marcus, I said. Mom, his voice was rough, strained. I need to see you, please, Vanessa and we need to talk to you. Both of you? I asked. Yes, he said. Both of us, can we come over, now? I looked around my small apartment, the place they'd always looked down on. All right, I said, come over. We'll be there in 20 minutes, Marcus said and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and waited. I'd spent 40 years building wealth in secret, teaching my son a lesson he'd failed to learn. Now, finally, we were going to have the conversation I should have had with him years ago. 23 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Marcus and Vanessa standing in the hallway. Marcus's eyes were red from crying. Vanessa looked pale and shaken. I let it ring 4 times before I answered. Hello, Marcus, I said. Mom, his voice was rough, strained. I need to see you, please, Vanessa and we need to talk to you. Both of you? I asked. Yes, he said, both of us. Can we come over now? I looked around my small apartment, the place they'd always looked down on. All right, I said, come over. We'll be there in 20 minutes, Marcus said and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table and waited. I'd spent 40 years building wealth in secret, teaching my son a lesson he'd failed to learn. Now, finally, we were going to have the conversation I should have had with him years ago. 23 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Marcus and Vanessa standing in the hallway. Marcus's eyes were red from crying. Vanessa looked pale and shaken. Come in, I said, stepping aside. They entered my small living room, and this time when Vanessa looked around, she didn't see poverty. She saw choice. She saw the intentional simplicity of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Sit down, I said, gesturing to the old couch. They sat. I took the armchair across from them. The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and heavy. Finally, Marcus spoke. Mom, he said, his voice breaking, I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry for everything. For uninviting you to Thanksgiving, for being ashamed of you. For treating you like you were less than us. I was wrong. I was so completely wrong. Vanessa was crying now, too. Mrs. Hamilton, she said, Dorothy, I don't even know what to say. My parents called me this afternoon. They told me about Thanksgiving dinner at your house. They told me who you really are, and I realized that we've been. Judging me, I finished for her. Yes, Vanessa whispered. We judged you. We looked at your apartment and your car and we assumed you were poor and we treated you like you were someone to be pitied or hidden away. And all along you were. You were more successful than any of us. Is that what you learned from this? I asked quietly. That I'm more successful than you, so now I deserve respect? Marcus looked at me confused. What do you mean? I mean that if the only reason you're apologizing is because you found out I'm wealthy, then you've learned nothing, I said. You still think respect is tied to net worth. You're still measuring people by their bank accounts. No, Marcus said quickly. That's not. I'm not apologizing because you have money. I'm apologizing because I treated my own mother like she was worthless. I'm apologizing because I was so focused on impressing people and maintaining appearances that I forgot what actually matters. And what matters, Marcus? I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Family, he finally said. Character, the values you tried to teach me my whole life. You lived simply because you wanted me to understand that material things don't make you happy. You worked hard because you wanted me to see the dignity in honest work. You invested wisely because you wanted to build security for us. And I took all those lessons and learned the opposite. I learned to worship money and status instead of understanding that you were showing me something deeper. I felt something loosen in my chest. Maybe he was starting to understand. When I saw you in that office today, Marcus continued, wearing that suit, talking to Martin like an equal, commanding that kind of respect, my first thought wasn't my mother has been lying to me. It was I've been blind. You were always worthy of respect. You always deserved to be treated with dignity and love, but I couldn't see it because I was looking at the wrong things. Vanessa reached over and took my hand. I grew up with money, she said softly. My parents gave me everything. I never had to struggle or save or work for anything. And I learned to look down on people who didn't have what I had. I learned that poverty was something to pity or avoid. But you had more than my parents ever had, and you chose to live like this. You chose simplicity, and I mocked you for it. I judged you for it. I convinced Marcus that you weren't good enough for our world. My parents told me something else, Vanessa continued. They said that at dinner, you talked about responsibility, about how people with resources have a responsibility to give back, to help others. They said you serve on nonprofit boards, that you've donated millions to hospitals and schools. They said you've spent your life building something meaningful, not just collecting money. She wiped her eyes. I've spent my life shopping and posting on Instagram and pretending to be important. You've actually done important things, and you never felt the need to tell anyone about it. I am so ashamed of how I've treated you. I looked at these two young people, my son and his wife, and saw something I hadn't seen before: genuine remorse. Not just embarrassment at being caught, not just fear of losing access to my wealth, but real understanding of what they'd done wrong. I appreciate your apologies, I said carefully. But apologizing is the easy part. The hard part is changing. The hard part is becoming different people. We want to change, Marcus said. We want to be better. We want to learn the lessons you tried to teach me. But Mom, I need to ask you something. What? Why didn't you just tell me? He asked. If you had all this money, if you were this successful, why hide it? Why let me think you were struggling? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. Because I wanted you to love me for who I was, not what I had, I said. I wanted you to learn that a person's worth isn't measured in dollars. I wanted you to see that happiness comes from living according to your values, not from impressing other people. I turned back to face them. But I made a mistake. I thought that by hiding my wealth, I would teach you humility. Instead, I taught you to be ashamed of poverty. I thought I was showing you that material things don't matter, but instead you learned to worship them even more. You spent your whole life trying to escape what you thought I was, trying to become someone different, someone better. And in the process, you became someone who didn't know his own mother. I want to know you now, Marcus said. The real you, will you let me? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, this person who'd hurt me deeply, but who seemed, finally, to be understanding why. Yes, I said, but on my terms. I'm not going to change how I live just to make you comfortable. I'm not moving to a penthouse or buying a luxury car. This apartment, this life, this is who I am. If you want to know me, you have to accept that. I do, Marcus said. I accept it. I understand it now. And Vanessa, I said, turning to her, I need you to understand something. I'm not going to be your project. I'm not going to be the person you try to make over or improve. I don't need improvement. I need respect. You have it, Vanessa said. I promise you, you have my respect. And Dorothy, I want to earn yours. I know I don't deserve it right now, but I want to try. We talked for hours that night. I told them about buying my first building, about learning to be a landlord, about the investments I'd made and the risks I'd taken. I told them about the choices I'd made to live simply, about the values that guided me, about the life I'd built that they'd never seen. And slowly, I began to see my son again. Not the status obsessed man who'd uninvited me from Thanksgiving, but the boy I'd raised, the good person I'd always believed was still in there somewhere. When they finally left, close to midnight, Marcus hugged me at the door. I love you, Mom, he said. Not because you're wealthy, not because you're successful, but because you're my mother and you've always been there for me, even when I didn't deserve it. I love you too, I said, and I meant it. After they left, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Maybe the lesson had finally been learned. Maybe my son had finally understood what I'd been trying to teach him all along. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Words were easy. The real test would be whether Marcus and Vanessa actually changed their lives, their values, their way of seeing the world. Only time would tell. The weeks following that confrontation were strange and delicate. Marcus called me every day, sometimes twice a day. At first, I thought it was guilt driving him, the need to prove he'd changed. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to hear something different in his voice, genuine curiosity. Mom, he said one Tuesday afternoon, I was thinking about what you said about your first property. The 8-unit building you bought when I was 5. Do you still own it? Yes, I said. I was at the property at that very moment, meeting with a contractor about updating the plumbing in 2 of the units. I'm here right now, actually. Would it be okay if I came to see it? Marcus asked. I know I was there as a kid, but I don't really remember it. I'd like to see what you built. I hesitated. This building represented the foundation of everything I'd accomplished. It was where I'd learned to be a landlord, where I'd made my first real money from investing. It felt vulnerable to show it to Marcus, to let him see the unglamorous reality of rental property management. But isn't that what I wanted? For him to see the real me, the real work behind the wealth? All right, I said. I'm meeting with a plumber here in about an hour. If you want to come by, I'll be here. I'll be there in 30 minutes, Marcus said. He arrived exactly 30 minutes later, pulling up in his BMW. I watched from the front steps of the building as he got out and looked up at the structure. It was a modest brick building, 4 stories tall, well-maintained but certainly not fancy. The neighborhood had improved significantly since I'd bought it 30 years ago, but it was still solidly working class. Marcus walked up to where I stood. He was wearing jeans and a sweater, not his usual work suit. It was Saturday, I realized. He'd driven here on his day off. This is it? He asked, looking at the building. This is it, I confirmed. The building that started everything. We walked inside. I showed him the lobby, which I'd renovated 15 years ago with tile I'd chosen myself and light fixtures I'd found at an architectural salvage yard. I showed him the mailboxes, each one labeled with a tenant's name. I showed him the basement where the original boiler had been replaced with a modern, efficient heating system. You did all this yourself? Marcus asked, running his hand along the wall. Not all of it, I said. I hired contractors for the big jobs, the electrical work, the heating system, but I did a lot of the cosmetic work myself. The painting, the tiling, the minor repairs. I couldn't afford to hire everything out in the beginning. We climbed the stairs to the second floor. I knocked on the door of Unit 2B, Mrs. Chen. I called out. It's Dorothy, I have someone with me. The door opened to reveal an elderly Chinese woman with a warm smile. Dorothy, come in, come in. And who is this handsome young man? This is my son, Marcus, I said. Marcus, this is Mrs. Chen. She's been living here for 23 years. 23 years, Mrs. Chen said, laughing. Can you believe it? I moved in when my husband was still alive, when this neighborhood was not so nice. But Dorothy, she always take good care of the building. She always fix things fast. Good landlord. Marcus looked at me with something like wonder. You've known Mrs. Chen for 23 years? Of course, I said. I know all my long-term tenants, Mrs. Chen's rent hasn't increased in 5 years because her husband passed away and she's living on Social Security. She's a good tenant, she pays on time, she takes care of her apartment. Why would I raise her rent just because the market says I can? Mrs. Chen patted my arm affectionately. See? Good landlord, not like those big companies that buy buildings and kick everyone out. Dorothy, she care about people. We said goodbye to Mrs. Chen and continued up the stairs. On the third floor, I showed Marcus a vacant unit I was preparing to rent. The previous tenant moved out last week, I explained. She got a job in another city. I'm repainting and replacing the carpet before the next tenant moves in. Marcus looked around the empty apartment. You do this between tenants every time? Every time, I confirmed. Fresh paint, clean carpets, thorough inspection of all appliances and fixtures. I want my tenants to feel like they're moving into a home, not just a rental unit. That must cost a lot, Marcus observed. It does, I agreed. But it also means I attract good tenants who take care of the place. It means people stay longer, which means less turnover and more stable income. It's an investment in the property and in the people who live here. We went up to the fourth floor, where the contractor was waiting to show me the plumbing issue. Marcus stood back and watched as I discussed the problem, asked technical questions, and negotiated a fair price for the repair. I could see him taking it all in, seeing me not as his poor mother, but as a competent businesswoman who knew her properties inside and out. After the contractor left, Marcus and I stood on the roof of the building. From here, we could see across the neighborhood to the downtown skyline in the distance. When you bought this building, Marcus said slowly, you were younger than I am now. Yes, I said. I was 28, you're 31. You were a widow with a young child, working 2 jobs, and you somehow saved enough to buy an 8-unit apartment building, Marcus continued. And you fixed it up yourself while raising me alone. I did what I had to do, I said simply. No, Marcus said, turning to look at me. You did what most people would never have the courage or the knowledge or the determination to do. Mom, I work in finance. I help wealthy clients invest their money. And most of them inherited their wealth or made it in one big deal. They didn't build it slowly over decades. They didn't do the actual work. They didn't learn every aspect of their investments the way you did. He paused, struggling with his words. I've been so stupid. I've been working at Brightstone for 6 years, thinking I was becoming successful because I wore expensive suits and drove a nice car. But I've just been helping other people manage their money. I haven't built anything. I haven't created anything. You built an empire from nothing, and I couldn't even see it because I was too busy being ashamed of your old car. You're still young, I said. You have time to build something meaningful. Will you teach me? Marcus asked. Will you show me how you did it? Not just the properties, but the mindset, the values, the way you think about money. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw genuine humility for the first time since he'd become an adult. Yes, I said. I'll teach you. Over the next several months, Marcus became my student. Every Saturday, he would meet me at one of my properties. He learned how to screen tenants, how to handle maintenance requests, how to budget for repairs and improvements. He learned how to read a lease, how to understand property taxes, how to calculate return on investment. But more importantly, he learned the philosophy behind what I did. We would sit in my small kitchen on Sunday mornings, drinking coffee, and I would explain the principles that had guided me. Money is a tool, I told him one morning. It's not the goal. The goal is security, freedom, and the ability to help others. Money is just the tool that makes those things possible. So why live in this apartment if you have millions? Marcus asked, not challenging, genuinely trying to understand. Because this apartment is enough, I said. It's warm, it's safe. It's filled with memories of your father and your childhood. Why would I need more space? Why would I need granite countertops and stainless steel appliances? Those things wouldn't make me happier. They would just make me a person who needs those things to be happy. Marcus nodded slowly. Vanessa and I have been talking about this, he said, about how much we spend trying to maintain an image. Our apartment costs $4,500 a month. We lease our cars. We spend thousands on clothes and restaurants and trips, all to show people that we're successful. And are you successful? I asked. We make good money, Marcus said, but we don't save any of it. We're living paycheck to paycheck, just at a higher income level than most people. If either of us lost our jobs, we'd be in trouble within a few months. That's not success, I said. That's a fancy prison. Marcus was quiet for a moment. We're going to make some changes, he said. Vanessa and I talked about it. We're going to move to a smaller apartment, something we can actually afford. We're going to start saving seriously. And we want to start investing in real estate like you did. That's a good start, I said. But remember, it's not about the money. It's about building security and living according to your values. I know, Marcus said, and Mom. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand what you were trying to teach me. You understand now, I said. That's what matters. Vanessa surprised me. I'd expected her to resist the changes Marcus wanted to make, but she embraced them. She called me one afternoon in March. Dorothy, she said, I'd like to take you to lunch, just the two of us. Would that be all right? We met at a small cafe near my apartment, not one of the expensive restaurants Vanessa usually frequented. She was dressed more simply than I'd ever seen her, in jeans and a sweater that looked like it came from a regular store, not a designer boutique. Thank you for meeting me, Vanessa said after we'd ordered. I know I haven't earned the right to your time or your forgiveness, but I wanted to talk to you. I'm listening, I said. I've been thinking a lot about my life, Vanessa said, about who I've been and who I want to be. I grew up with parents who had money, and I learned to define myself by the things I owned and the places I went and the people I knew. But I've never built anything. I've never created anything. I've just consumed. She looked down at her hands. Marcus has been telling me about the Saturdays he spends with you, learning about your properties. He comes home excited, talking about tenants and repairs and investment strategies. He's more engaged and energized than I've ever seen him. And I realized that I want that too. I want to build something meaningful. What do you want to build? I asked. I don't know yet, Vanessa admitted, but I know I don't want to keep working in marketing, selling luxury products to people who don't need them. I want to do something that matters, and I was hoping you might help me figure out what that is. I studied her carefully. This isn't about impressing me or making up for how you treated me. No, Vanessa said firmly. This is about me finally growing up and becoming someone I can respect. You were right about everything. I've been shallow and materialistic and cruel, but I want to change. I am changing. And I'd like your guidance if you're willing to give it. Over the next months, I spent time with Vanessa as well as Marcus. I discovered that beneath her polished exterior was a woman who genuinely wanted to make a difference. She started volunteering at a women's shelter, using her marketing skills to help them with fundraising. She began taking classes in nonprofit management at the community college. I've been thinking about starting a foundation, Vanessa told me one day. Something that helps single mothers get job training and housing assistance. Women in situations like you were in when Marcus was young. But I don't know where to start. Start by listening to the women you're trying to help, I said. Don't assume you know what they need, ask them. Learn from them and start small. You don't need to change the world overnight. Just help one person, then another, then another. Vanessa took my advice. She started small, helping individual women at the shelter with resume writing and interview preparation. Then she expanded to helping them find affordable housing. And slowly, she built something real. Marcus and Vanessa moved out of their expensive penthouse and into a modest two-bedroom apartment that cost half as much. They sold one of their leased cars and bought a used, reliable vehicle with cash. They stopped eating at expensive restaurants and started cooking at home. They stopped buying designer clothes and started shopping at regular stores. And they started saving. For the first time in their lives, they had money left over at the end of each month. Money they invested, money they saved for emergencies, money that worked for them instead of them working for money. 6 months after our confrontation at Brightstone Investments, Marcus called me with excitement in his voice. Mom, he said, there's a small apartment building for sale in the neighborhood near yours. 4 units, it needs work, but the price is reasonable. Vanessa and I have been saving, and we have enough for a down payment. Would you? Would you look at it with me? Tell me if you think it's a good investment. We looked at the building together. It was similar to my first property, small, rundown, in a neighborhood that was improving but not yet gentrified. The price was $320,000. Marcus and Vanessa had saved $80,000 for a down payment. I walked through the building with Marcus, pointing out problems and potential. The roof needed replacing. The plumbing was old. 2 of the units needed complete renovation. But the bones of the building were good and the location was promising. It's a good starter property, I told Marcus. But it's going to be a lot of work. Are you prepared for that? I am, Marcus said. Vanessa and I have been talking about it. We'll do a lot of the renovation work ourselves on weekends. We'll learn as we go, like you did. And you understand that being a landlord means late night phone calls about broken toilets. It means dealing with difficult tenants. It means sacrificing time and comfort to maintain the property. I understand, Marcus said. And Mom, I want to do this. Not to get rich quickly, but to build something meaningful, to create housing for people who need it, to learn the value of hard work and patience, to build security for our future family. All the things you tried to teach me. I felt tears in my eyes. Then I think you should buy it, I said. Marcus and Vanessa bought the building. I cautioned the loan to help them get better terms, and I agreed to be a silent partner, offering advice but letting them make the decisions and do the work. I watched my son transform over the following months. He spent his weekends covered in paint and drywall dust. He learned to fix toilets and patch walls. He learned to negotiate with contractors and deal with tenant complaints. He learned what I'd learned 30 years ago. That wealth isn't just about money, it's about the skills you develop, the character you build, the person you become. One Saturday afternoon in June, almost a year after our confrontation, I received a call from Richard Parker, Vanessa's father. Dorothy, he said, Alina and I are coming to Philadelphia next week. We'd love to take you to dinner, just the three of us if you're available. We met at a nice restaurant, nothing too fancy. Richard and Alina looked different somehow, more relaxed, less concerned with appearances. We wanted to thank you, Alina said after we'd ordered, for what you've done for Vanessa and Marcus. I haven't done anything, I said. They've done the work themselves. You showed them a different way to live, Richard said. Vanessa calls us every week now, tells us about the building they're renovating, about her volunteer work at the shelter, about how happy she is. She sounds more fulfilled than she's ever been, and it's because you taught her that meaning comes from building something, not buying something. We've been doing some reflecting ourselves, Alina added. Richard and I have spent our lives accumulating things and impressing people. We have a beautiful home and expensive cars and memberships to exclusive clubs, but we don't have what you have. We don't have the satisfaction of building something from nothing. We don't have the relationships with people like Mrs. Chen, people whose lives we've touched in meaningful ways. It's not too late, I said gently. You can still choose to live differently. We're starting to, Richard said. We've begun volunteering at a medical clinic that serves uninsured patients. We're using our resources to help people instead of just entertaining ourselves. And it feels good. It feels right. We talked for hours that night about values and purpose and the different ways people define success. When we parted, Alina hugged me. Thank you for teaching our daughter what we should have taught her ourselves, she said. Thank you for raising a woman capable of change, I replied. On Thanksgiving Day, 1 year after I'd hosted Richard and Alina at my brownstone while Marcus and Vanessa ate alone, we all gathered together. Not at the brownstone this time, but at Marcus and Vanessa's modest apartment. The apartment was small, the furniture was simple, and the food was homemade, not catered. But it was filled with warmth and love and genuine gratitude. We sat around the table, me, Marcus, Vanessa, Richard, Alina, and Mrs. Chen, whom I'd invited because she'd mentioned she'd be alone for the holiday. We held hands while Marcus said grace. I'm thankful for my mother, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion, who loved me enough to let me fail, who was patient enough to let me learn, and who was strong enough to show me what really matters. I'm thankful for Vanessa, who had the courage to change alongside me. I'm thankful for Richard and Alina, who accepted me despite my mistakes. And I'm thankful for the lessons I've learned this year. That wealth is what you build, not what you spend. That character is more valuable than status. And that family is defined by love and respect, not by blood alone. I looked around the table at these people. My son who'd finally understood, his wife who'd found her purpose, her parents who'd begun their own journey of transformation, and Mrs. Chen who represented the community I'd served for decades. This was wealth. This was success. After dinner, Marcus pulled me aside. Mom, he said, I have something for you. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000. What's this? I asked. It's the first payment, Marcus said. Remember when I said I wanted to pay you back for everything? For the wedding, for the rent you paid on our old apartment, for all the times you helped us without us knowing? This is the start. It's going to take me years to pay it all back, but I'm going to do it, because I need to. Because understanding the value of money means taking responsibility for the money I've wasted. Marcus, I said softly, you don't have to. I do, he interrupted. Please let me do this. Let me show you that I've learned. Let me prove that I'm becoming the man you raised me to be. I looked at my son, this man who'd once been ashamed of me, who'd uninvited me from Thanksgiving, who'd judged me by my old car and small apartment. He'd become someone different, someone better. All right, I said, accepting the check, but I'm not keeping this money. What? Marcus looked confused. I'm going to put it into an account, I explained. And when you have children, when you're ready to teach them the lessons I tried to teach you, I'll give it to you. You can use it for their education or their first property investment or whatever will help them learn the values you've learned. This money will be an inheritance of lessons, not just dollars. Marcus's eyes filled with tears. He hugged me tightly. Thank you, Mom, he whispered, for everything, for never giving up on me. That night, after everyone had gone home, I sat in my small apartment and reflected on the past year. I'd exposed my secret, revealed my wealth, confronted my son with the truth of who I was. The journey had been painful, but it had also been necessary. Marcus had needed to see that his mother wasn't the poor, simple woman he'd imagined. He'd needed to understand that living simply was a choice, not a constraint. He'd needed to learn that respect should never be based on bank accounts or material possessions. And he'd learned, he'd changed, he'd become someone I could be proud of again. I thought about the document sitting in my safe, the trust fund I'd voided the night of Sarah's wedding. No, wait, that wasn't my story. That was someone else's story. I thought about the will sitting in my safe, the one I'd updated last week. Marcus was still my primary beneficiary, but now the inheritance came with conditions. The money would be placed in a trust that would pay out slowly over decades, not in one lump sum. And it came with a letter explaining my philosophy, my values, my hopes for how the money would be used. I didn't want to leave Marcus money that would make his life easy. I wanted to leave him money that would help him build something meaningful, that would give him the freedom to make choices based on values instead of necessity, that would allow him to help others the way I'd tried to help others throughout my life. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Marcus. Mom, he said, I forgot to tell you, Vanessa and I have some news. What's that? We're pregnant, he said, joy evident in his voice. We found out last week we're having a baby. I felt my heart swell with emotion. Oh, Marcus, that's wonderful news. We want to raise this child differently than I was raised, Marcus said. We want to teach them the lessons you tried to teach me. We want them to understand the value of hard work, the importance of living below your means, the joy of building something meaningful. Will you help us? Will you teach your grandchild what you taught me? Of course, I said. I'd be honored. After we hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment and smiled. A grandchild, a new generation, a chance to pass on the lessons I'd learned, the values I'd lived by, the wisdom that came from building wealth slowly and deliberately over decades. I thought about the child Marcus and Vanessa would raise. They would grow up in a modest apartment, watching their parents work hard, save carefully, and build steadily. They would see their father renovating apartment buildings on weekends. They would see their mother helping women at the shelter. They would visit their grandmother in her small apartment and learn that wealth isn't about what you display, but what you build. And maybe, just maybe, they would learn the lessons earlier than Marcus had. Maybe they wouldn't need to be shocked into understanding. Maybe they would grow up knowing that character matters more than possessions, that family matters more than status, that the richest life is one lived according to your deepest values. I walked to the window and looked out at the street below. This neighborhood, this modest area where I'd chosen to live despite being able to afford anywhere, was where it had all started. This was where I'd raised my son, where I'd built my empire quietly and carefully, where I'd learned that true wealth is measured not in dollars, but in the impact you have on the people around you. Marcus had been ashamed of this place, of this life. But now he understood. Now he saw what I'd been trying to show him all along, that this small apartment represented freedom, that the old car represented choice, that the simple life represented wisdom. The lesson had been learned. The circle was complete. And now a new circle was beginning, with a grandchild who would inherit not just money, but the values and wisdom that had created that money. I thought about the story that had brought us here, about the wedding invitation I'd never received, about the sign at the gate that said, "Do not let in." about the Thanksgiving I'd spent with strangers instead of family. Those painful moments had been necessary. They'd been the catalyst for change. Sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give a child isn't protection from pain, but the space to experience consequences. Sometimes love means stepping back and letting someone fall, knowing they need to hit bottom before they can truly change. I'd let Marcus fall. I'd watched him crash, and then I'd watched him pick himself up and become someone better. That was the real inheritance I was leaving him. Not the money in my accounts or the properties in my portfolio, but the knowledge of how to build a meaningful life. The wisdom to see beyond appearances and the strength to live according to his values, even when the world tells him to value other things. The phone rang again. This time it was Vanessa. "Dorothy," she said, "I hope it's not too late to call." "It's never too late," I said. "I wanted to tell you something," Vanessa continued. "The shelter where I volunteer, they've asked me to join their board of directors. They want me to help them develop a program for single mothers, teaching them financial literacy, and helping them start small businesses. And I realized that I couldn't have done any of this without you. You showed me what it means to use your resources to build something meaningful. You showed me that the most valuable thing you can give someone isn't money, it's knowledge and opportunity." "I'm proud of you, Vanessa," I said. "You've become someone remarkable." "I'm trying to become someone like you," she said softly. "Someone who builds instead of consumes, someone who helps instead of judges, someone who lives with purpose instead of just living for appearances." After we hung up, I realized that this was perhaps the greatest unexpected gift of the past year. Not just getting my son back, but gaining a daughter. Vanessa had started as someone I barely tolerated, someone who represented everything I disliked about materialistic culture. But she transformed into a woman of substance and purpose. The next morning, I woke up early and drove to the building where Marcus and Vanessa were working on their renovations. I wanted to see their progress, to watch them building their future with their own hands. When I arrived, I found them both in Unit 3A, covered in paint, working together to transform a rundown apartment into someone's future home. They looked tired and happy, arguing good-naturedly about what color to paint the kitchen. "Cream," Vanessa was saying. "Cream is neutral and classic." "But cream shows every mark," Marcus countered. "What about a light gray?" They looked up when I walked in. "Mom," Marcus said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "I wanted to see how the work was coming along," I said. They showed me around the apartment, pointing out what they'd accomplished: new flooring, updated electrical, a renovated bathroom. They showed me their plans for the kitchen, the living room, the bedrooms. They talked about the tenant they hoped to attract, someone who would appreciate what they were creating. As I watched them work, I thought about the parallel with my own journey. 40 years ago, I'd stood in a rundown apartment just like this one, trying to figure out how to make it livable, how to turn a liability into an asset, how to build wealth one careful choice at a time. Now my son was doing the same thing. Not because I'd given him the money to do it, but because he'd learned the lessons himself. He'd learned that wealth comes from work, that security comes from building, that meaning comes from creating something valuable. "What do you think, Mom?" Marcus asked, pulling me from my thoughts. "Are we doing this right?" I looked around the apartment at the careful work they'd done, at the transformation they were creating. "You're doing it perfectly," I said, but I wasn't just talking about the apartment. I was talking about their lives, their transformation, their journey from shallow materialism to meaningful purpose. They were doing it right. Finally, after all the mistakes and pain and hard lessons, they were doing it right. As I drove home that afternoon, I thought about the story of the past year. It would have been easy to write Marcus off, to cut him out of my life when he uninvited me from Thanksgiving. It would have been easy to punish him with my wealth, to show him what he'd lost and leave him to suffer the consequences. But that wouldn't have taught him anything. That would have just made me cruel. Instead, I'd done something harder. I'd exposed the truth and then given him space to process it. I'd shown him who I really was and then waited to see if he would rise to the challenge of becoming someone worthy of that truth. And he had. He'd risen. He'd changed. He'd become someone I could respect and be proud of. That was the real success story here. Not the millions of dollars I'd accumulated, not the properties I'd bought, not the empire I'd built. The real success was watching my son transform from someone who valued all the wrong things into someone who understood what truly mattered. We live in a world obsessed with appearances, with filters and facades, with presenting a perfect image to the world. Marcus had learned to worship at that altar, to judge people by their possessions and status rather than their character and values. But he'd also learned to reject that world, to see through the illusions, to understand that true worth isn't found in a bank account or a designer label, but in the calluses of hard work and the integrity of one's word. Sometimes the greatest act of love a parent can offer isn't giving their child everything they want, but stepping back and letting them build their own life, even if they have to start from rock bottom, even if they have to learn through pain and failure, even if it means watching them struggle. I'd spent 40 years living simply while building wealth in secret. I thought I was teaching Marcus humility, but I'd actually taught him shame. The lesson had failed because I'd hidden the truth. But when I finally revealed the truth, when I showed him who I really was and let him see the disconnect between his assumptions and reality, that's when the real lesson began. That's when Marcus started to understand that appearances are deceiving, that people contain multitudes, that you can't judge someone's worth by their car or their apartment or their clothes. Now, as I pulled into the parking lot of my small apartment building, I felt a deep sense of peace. The journey wasn't over. Marcus and Vanessa still had years of work ahead of them, years of building and learning and growing. The grandchild would bring new challenges and new opportunities to teach. But the foundation had been laid. The lessons had been learned. The values had been passed on. I'd built an empire of wealth over 40 years. But in the past year, I'd built something more valuable. A relationship with my son based on truth and respect, a legacy of values that would outlive me, and the satisfaction of knowing that the lessons I'd tried to teach had finally been learned. That night, I updated my journal, the one I'd been keeping since I bought my first property. I wrote about the past year, about the confrontation and the transformation, about watching Marcus become someone worthy of the inheritance I would leave him. And I wrote a letter, one I would attach to my will, explaining everything to my future grandchild. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. But I want you to know the story of your family, the real story, not the one people might assume when they see your inheritance. Your grandfather died when your father was only 3 years old. I was left with almost nothing, a toddler, a mortgage, and barely enough savings to last a month. But I had something more valuable, the determination to build a better life and the wisdom to understand that wealth isn't about what you spend, it's about what you build. I lived simply, saved carefully, and invested wisely. I built an empire quietly, without fanfare, without needing anyone to know or admire what I was doing. And I tried to teach your father these lessons, but for many years he didn't understand. He thought I was poor. He was ashamed of me. He judged me by my old car and small apartment. And in doing so, he learned the opposite of what I wanted to teach him. He learned to worship wealth and status instead of understanding that true worth comes from character and values. But then something happened. I showed him the truth. I let him see who I really was, and I watched him transform into someone I could be proud of. By the time you're old enough to understand this letter, your father will have taught you the lessons I taught him. You'll know the value of hard work. You'll understand that living below your means gives you freedom. You'll see that building something meaningful is more satisfying than buying something expensive. This inheritance isn't just money. It's the freedom to make choices based on your values instead of your needs. It's the opportunity to build something meaningful. It's the responsibility to use your resources to help others. Don't let it make you lazy. Don't let it make you entitled. Let it give you the freedom to live according to your deepest values, to build something meaningful, to make a difference in the world. And remember, wealth is quiet. Wealth is what you build, not what you display. The people who need to prove they're rich usually aren't. The people who are truly wealthy don't need to tell anyone. Live simply, build steadily, give generously. Those are the lessons that built this inheritance, and they're the lessons that will make you worthy of it. With all my love, your grandmother, Dorothy Hamilton. I sealed the letter and placed it in my safe with my will and all the other documents that would guide my estate after I was gone. Then I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite chair, the old one I'd bought at a yard sale 30 years ago, and reupholstered myself. I looked around my small apartment, at the simple furniture and worn carpets, at the life I'd chosen to live despite having the means to live very differently. This was enough. This had always been enough. And now, finally, my son understood that too. The lesson had been learned. The circle was complete, and the legacy would continue. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's wisdom. It's values. It's the understanding that true wealth is measured not in what you have, but in who you've become and what you've built. I'd built wealth. But more importantly, I'd built character. I'd built resilience. I'd built a legacy of values that would outlive me. And now, finally, I could rest knowing that legacy was secure.